Hello! How very nice to see you all. My name's Vivian Parry. I'm a science writer and broadcaster, and I'm thrilled to be here, even though it's a horribly wet and miserable day here in Brussels for this wonderful TechEthos event. Now, as you all know, the European Union has been a real trailblazer in the ethics of the regulation of the ethics of emerging technologies. And the results from TechEthos, which was a project which was set up with £4 million from Horizon 2020, is going to be the basis for our discussions today. Oh, sorry. Oh, was I doing pounds? Well, I'm so glad it wasn't pounds, because our currency has just fallen to the floor. So you would only had about half the money you thought you had. Sorry. No, we still can't say sorry for Brexit enough. Sorry. Sorry. But we will be back. We are coming back. Right. Let's start properly. Let me start by introducing to you Eva Buchinger. Eva. Now, hello. Eva is the leader of TechEthos, and so it's a wonderful day for you today because it marks the culmination of 3 long years of work.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Thank you, Vivian. Good morning to everybody. A very warm welcome. And we are really happy that you made the effort to come here and share with us this day on, we think, very important topics. So indeed, we are going in the 3rd year of a 3-year project of TechEthos. And so, yeah, you say culmination, maybe that's right, yeah. So this project gives us the opportunity to talk about an issue which we think is most people will say, yes, it's an important issue, but when it comes, what does it mean? So what actions have to follow? Maybe it's quickly very less prominent and important. So we are really happy that we have this opportunity to share this whole day together with you and discuss this important issue of ethics of new and emerging technology.
Now, this event is co-hosted with Barbara Thaler. Barbara Thaler is not here, but that is rather good news, I think, isn't it? Not in the sense that you might think not having her here, but it's good news for Barbara herself.
Yeah, so she's Barbara Thaler, co-host, a member of parliament. But you make plans and then life happens. And in the case of Barbara Thaler, I think for her, this is a success. So maybe if you get the other one, you will see. I step to the side. You see, over the weekend there were some interesting issues in Austria. A very unforeseen election, and Barbara Thaler won the election, and she is now the new president of the Chamber of Economic Commerce in Austria. She will step back, and she has now interviews, media issues, and everything. She called me yesterday morning and apologized very much, gives her warm greetings, wishes all of you, wishes us all the best, and so we can only congratulate her.
But we should record also that actually we are very grateful to her because she's been such a supporter for this project, hasn't she?
Absolutely. It wouldn't be this event without Barbara Thaler, so we are very grateful and thankful. That's true.
Terrific. So we're looking forward to a great day and we'll hear from you a little later. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now let me introduce somebody who I always think is the beating heart of ethics in the Commission, Mihalos Kritikos. Mihalos is a policy analyst at the Ethics and Integrity sector of the European Commission, working on the ethical development of emerging technologies with a special emphasis on AI ethics. But before that, as many of you'll know, he was working the Scientific Foresight Services, more specifically within STOA, and I think of him always as STOA. Mihalis.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. and contributing to the success of this important event. I'm not the best person to talk about the project. I'm a bit biased because I have been following their work for the last 3 years. So I know more of the inner workings and the dynamics and the final outputs of this project. But I'll start by saying something about the event. The event is focused on what the Commission considers as being flagship policy initiatives, the ethics of digital transformation and the ethics of the so-called green transition. And these are two pillars of our policies that are extremely important, and these are two pillars that require societal acceptance. And the key to societal acceptance and the key to what we call just transition, just digital transition, just green transition is ethics. And I think TechEthos has managed to bring forward the values that should underpin this dual twin transition, as we call it. And it brings forward also policy advice to the whole European ecosystem that, if taken, if followed, I think it's going to help us reflect well and design our policies in a way that are inclusive, that are fair, that are making somehow justice to the whole ecosystem of ethics. I have to say that as you very well know, this just transition is a long journey. It cannot happen simply because someone asked for it or because a project delivered a certain outcome. It's a continuous process, and for that reason we want the whole TechEthos ecosystem to be with us, to continue working along these issues, to continue producing reflections, to continue, let's say, raising the right questions for legislators and policymakers. And I'm taking now the opportunity to also highlight a couple of, or I would say 3 points that impressed me throughout the project, the kind of implementation of the project, and as kind of policy advice to us. The first thing is the need to incorporate, to include fundamental rights impact assessments and fundamental rights in the discussion on CDR, the discussion on climate change. The second thing is, and for us it's extremely important, I'll explain to you why, is to find a way to measure the environmental footprint of digital technologies. And this is where these two kind of ecosystems come together, the digital one and the environmental one. And the third element, which I consider to be, and we consider to be very important, is let's say the effort to come up with a standard protocol for informed consent in the virtual environment. This is an important issue for us, not only for us, for our kids, for everybody that is navigating in the digital environment, especially when we talk about digital extended reality environments. And this is something that I think you should pursue in a more consistent way in the years to come through other projects. And I'm saying that these points are important not only from a policy perspective, but also because right now my team, I'm working, I forgot to introduce myself, I'm working for the ethics review team of the European Commission. Basically what we do is to manage a process of reviewing, assessing proposals that come for funding at the EU level from an ethical perspective. So we set up expert panels that come together either in Brussels or remotely to discuss digital projects, climate change projects, and find out whether there are ethical issues or questions that need to be addressed. We also audit projects, so we don't only intervene at the very outset of the projects, but also during the implementation of them. And also we produce guidelines, and this is where our work kind of meets your work, because right now we're trying to produce and to develop guidance frameworks for measuring the environmental effect of digital technologies. So your recommendations are mostly welcome. And also to find ways to enhance, to empower the citizen, to empower the user, the research participant, as we call it in a research project, in the virtual environment. And there is another guidance note that on informed consent and in the domain of artificial intelligence. So I think there is plenty of potential for us to collaborate thematically in person, and for you to work for us as ethics advisors and ethics reviewers, or to continue producing, let's say, research deliverables and policy recommendations in future projects. I'll stop here and by saying that your recommendations and your kind of policy options are going to be tested firstly within our environment. So we're the primary recipients of your work, simply because we're working on the ethics. We're the team that works on the ethics of new and emerging technologies, and we would be the first ones that will be asked to implement, to test whether your recommendations are waterproof, are make sense in applied ethics context. I wish you a nice and productive meeting, fruitful discussions, and I also apologize for our Deputy Director General not being here today because he has some extra meetings in the office. I'll stay here for the whole day, so I'll be happy to discuss with all of you issues that I just mentioned, and I think are kind of serve the basis for future cooperation and for your work to be fed into the policy making process, because I think that's the added that could, beyond the academic, let's say, beauty of what you write and what you publish. I think at a certain point, some of what you do and produce should feed into our procedures, our mechanisms, in order to kind of produce what we call added value in societal terms, in order to make the difference between what is on paper and what is the reality of a research project or a research ecosystem, where you as a researcher has to face certain challenges, and sometimes you feel unguided and you don't know how to address issues of informed consent or how to measure the environmental effects of certain algorithmic decision making systems. I'll stop here because I can speak for the whole day. Again, thanks for your work, and thanks for being up to the occasion and producing recommendations and deliverables that make sense, and hopefully are not going to end up in another shelf of a commission library, as sometimes some projects end up being. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And actually, what we're seeing here is something that's so welcome, which is ethics embedded and integrated right from the very start, and not ending up on a shelf, but actually as proper policy. So have we got any policymakers here? Policymakers? I suspect they're all online. So if you're online, hello policymakers. You're probably dipping in from your office. Well, I'm very glad that you're dipping in, because this is a great session for you to be in. What we're going to do now is we're going to have two parts of our day. We're going to have digital transformation in the morning, and we're going to have ethics for the green transition in the afternoon. But first of all, we're going to start with Eva Buchinger back again to give us an overview of TechEthos.
So I find the pointer, and will tell us a little bit about the project which makes this day possible. So, of course, this day we will not explain everything what we have done in TechEthos. It's not a project day, but we use the opportunity to have wonderful keynote speakers, to have wonderful, marvelous panelists, and to have you, the audience, here in the room and online to discuss these issues and give you a little information what makes this day possible. And this is the project TechEthos. I would like to start with a quote from a philosopher. Oh, I see, wherever I stand, also I'm not very tall. Someone is, so I will move around in someone's way. So maybe this is a good place here. Well, Martin Heidegger made with this statement reminds us that technology is something which is pervasive. It's everywhere, and seeing it as something neutral is of course an option, but maybe not the best option. So one can say, and he says, even if we affirm or deny it, if we like or dislike it. So maybe someone could say, well, this is a bit of pessimistic perspective on technology, but I don't read it in that way. I think it's just saying to us, be aware, and this is never wrong. And what we are doing, we're having this as a kind of framing in our minds, and what we are doing with this, we're making a challenge out of it, or we made a challenge out of it in the TechEthos project. And the challenge is, on the one hand, we have R&D, we have research and development, we have innovation, we have researchers in industry and in academia, and they have their rationalities, they have their plan, they have their goals, their milestones, and we want to help them to have from the beginning a kind of feeling what ethics means and why ethics could be and is important, and not only within the realm of research, but also in the wider society. So we take up desires, the concern of society, and we reflect them. Of course, in this project, we did not cover every technology available. We have a technology portfolio consisting of climate engineering, digital extended reality, and neurotechnologies. And as you have seen from the program, this is reflected in the schedule of this day. So what approaches are we using to deal with this challenge? This is just a selection, as we said, TechEthos now in a nutshell. So we use horizon scanning, which is an anticipatory looking for ethics, I think something very established. We follow the ethics by design idea. This is exactly something what I addressed just before, taking ethics seriously from the very, very beginning, from the first stages of a innovation technology development process. And just as I said, a selection. Another thing I want to highlight here is engagement. So also we have wonderful experts within the TechEthos team. You will see some of them during the day and hear some of them during the day. We have engaged external experts and also citizens. I will come back to citizens later on. So including experts means in TechEthos, including researchers, including users, the broadest citizen, but also including intermediaries such as research ethics committees. So this is a multi-stakeholder approach and a multi-method approach. I want to highlight the citizen engagement because maybe this is something which you will not see every day. What we did, we decided that we will use serious gaming, and we looked at the broad range of games available, and then we thought, well, there are really wonderful games already available and tested, but they do not exactly fit what we need in TechEthos. So we developed the TechEthos game Ages of Technology Impact. It was played in 6 European countries, which means it has to be translated in different languages. And it engaged more than 300 citizens, including vulnerable groups. So this is just highlighting one of many things I could highlight here. What are our achievements? There are so many, don't worry. I won't go through every item and explain it. Also, there's a lot to explain. Maybe the most important here is we have it on our web page. So if you go to our web page and you look at resources, you find all these things. You see, these are the deliverables. And here I want just to say we have this idea of scan, analyze, enhance. And for everything you find what we have delivered until now. And we have not only the TechEthos tool, but we have also created an anticipatory ethics metrics and societal readiness tool. So you see, we really tried to provide not only intellectual reflection, which is of course important, and engage people, which is also important, but also to have as a legacy something very practical, namely tools. This is just an overview. We are at the end of a 3-year project, and you see the line here. So we are really, this is policy, so we are really now coming to the end, and we are so happy to share all this with you together. Before I come to the end, this is another thing I want to highlight, and Mihalis had already mentioned it. So we have pages, I think I can say thousands of pages over all deliverables together. It was clear that only some people will read everything, or some will read something. So we condensed key messages. And these key messages are available in form of policy briefs. This is just a start. If you go again, you find everything at our homepage. This is just again a selection, and I made a screenshot just as they came, so it was not a specific selection, just as they came on our webpage, and you will find there in our 2 panels, 2 colleagues from our project, Alexei and Dominic. They will present not all of the key messages, but a very, very interesting selection. So it will be a really great experience to listen to the selection of key messages of the TechEthos project. Yeah, and nothing without people. So this is the TechEthos team. We are 10 altogether 16 organizations from 13 different countries. So this was the first in-person meeting in Vienna. This was again in the same building, not the same room, but the same building here in Brussels. And then this, no, there is one missing, and this was in Rome, our meeting this May. And we have not only the team, we have a very, very helpful and supportive advisory and impact board, wonderful people. We have the stakeholders, a cluster network, and we have very good guidance from our project and policy officers from the Commission. So this is TechEthos in a nutshell, and this gives the opportunity for this day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eva. Actually, I think your most magnificent achievement of all is managing to get your briefs down into 2 pages.
Yes.
That is something
Yeah.
really to be very proud of.
I have to confess, some of them have 4 pages, but some of them have 2 pages.
But actually, and that's actually a key learning, because whatever you produce, if it's not read, it has no impact at all. And people cannot and do not read more than a couple of pages. So thank you for doing that. You've already produced something of huge value.
Our pleasure, I say, for the TechEthos team. Thank you.
So let's press ahead with our digital transformation, our ethics for digital transformation. I am so delighted that we have an absolutely magnificent speaker to start us off, Laura Weidinger from DeepMind, who's going to talk about the ethical challenges of emerging technologies for the digital transformation. Obviously, AI has been her particular thing. She's a senior research scientist at DeepMind, and her focus has been on AI ethics. But I think she's going to have a bit of a kind of wider brief for us. Laura.
Hello, everyone. And it's really exciting for me to be here. Thank you for having me. As Vivian mentioned, I'm a senior research scientist. I work in a team called Ethics Research Team. And so really, I usually speak to research conferences and sort of peers in the more academic realms. And it's really exciting to see how the work that we do is of interest to kind of policy audiences. So this is a new forum for me, and I'm really excited to talk to you about the kind of work that we do. And I will say that there's a long title here, and I've just been told that long papers don't get read. So, what I'm talking to you about is really, in a nutshell, kind of generative AI systems. So, everybody's, I think, familiar with ChatGPT. There's these kinds of generative language models. They can now produce images and so on as well. That's the generative AI system in the title. And then, what I really want to talk about is how do we know when those systems are safe? And how do we know when they're ethical? How do we know that they're safe to release or under what conditions? And that's been the heart of my work for a few years now. And we've summarized a whole bunch of our research here, and I'm listing all the co-authors. There's a bunch of us kind of philosophers, engineers, ethicists, who have worked on this. And if you Google this title, you end up with a 30-page report. If you don't read 30-page reports, you can also go on the DeepMind website. There's a blog where we summarize everything in maybe 2 pages, readable formats. So let me first start kind of leveling a little bit what this very wieldy kind of title actually means and breaking it down a bit. So let's start with the concept of safety. Everybody talks about AI safety now, including kind of the UK summit that happened last week. And of course, it's really critical in the context of the AI Act and so on. So the way we think from a researcher perspective about what is the kind of research problem here is that there's 4 pieces that make up ethics and safety. And I'll come to what socio-technical means in a second. But the 4 pieces, first is kind of obvious. You need foresight. And I think TechEthos, in a sense, has been doing this. So what that looked like for us in the context of generative AI systems is a previous report that we brought out 2 years ago, a kind of peer-reviewed paper that also has a blog with it, where we essentially surveyed the lay of the land and said, okay, these language models are coming. This came out before ChatGPT, because we can obviously see these things kind of coming, and we can look at what kinds of risks are we already seeing in the world. So, for example, representation harms, like maybe you've heard about bias and discrimination. We already know this is an established problem in AI and, for example, in credit scoring systems, in educational tools and so on. So it's sort of an old problem with AI that has now also found its way into generative AI systems. And then there's information and safety harms, which are more around kind of private data that might leak if you have a new model that's been trained on a lot of data. Misinformation, a huge area of concern. I'll come back to it. Questions in the context of generative systems are, of course, we can now generate synthetic images that look like they are photorealistic. So what does that mean for misinformation, malicious use, all kinds of things that you could do with these models that could cause harm. Human autonomy and integrity harms are really something I'm personally very passionate about. I think it remains understudied, which is kind of how we relate to those systems as they become more human-like. Now that for the first time we're confronted with a technology that uses human language in a compelling way, we're actually dealing with a kind of new way of engaging with this kind of technology, and that raises ethics questions. And finally, socio-economic and environmental harm, things like changing the nature of jobs, creating precarity, environmental harm, and so on. So this is a whistle-stop tour. It's not the substance of the talk. I just wanted to say foresight is sort of the first step of what we've been doing, and it sets up really nicely where we are now. So the second big piece of working on safety of these systems and their ethics, I think, is to actually evaluate the system. So it's good enough to know that there's some kind of risk coming, but how do you know if the technology you're dealing with here actually creates this kind of risk of harm, or to what extent, or whether a mitigation works at all? You kind of need to find a way to operationalize these complex risks into something measurable. It doesn't have to be quantitative, can also be qualitative, but it needs to be somehow you need to be able to say something about a real system in front of you. And that's the topic of evaluation, which I'll really be focusing on, because I think it's sort of it is the main milestone that we're kind of having to clear as an industry now. And then there's 2 more pieces that are sort of ongoing, right? So alignment is basically, maybe you've heard about value alignment as a sort of topic. It's kind of making sure the technology is actually aligned with what people want it to do and with the communities who are meant to use it. So it's no good if we have a technology that is very good at performing some task, but actually doesn't serve the users that are actually trying to use it. And that also requires engagement. So engagement, of course, with policymakers, but actually a lot with kind of the people who are meant to use this technology and also people who are meant to regulate it, to see under what circumstances can, for example, a generative AI system actually safely be used? What should be the constraints about what kind of capabilities it is allowed to have, or what kinds of, I don't want to go too technical, but what kinds of fine-tunings or filters, like what kind of adaptations should be made to the technology in light of how people are actually going to use it. All of these are kind of engagement questions. So this is, I think, the overall space of technology safety that we are looking at. And I promised you I would talk mostly about evaluation and explain what socio-technical means. So socio-technical is really coming from the insight that in order for a generative AI system to work as intended, human and technological factors have to work together. So when we are analyzing the safety of an AI system, it is insufficient to just look at the technical artifact in front of us, because that is not really how it works in the world. People have to use it. Someone's insights have been used to train the system. Somebody has to prompt the system, has to act on the outputs of the system. It will be embedded in societal structures, maybe into a company, maybe into a kind of public process. So socio-technical is basically, it's a whole research field. And the point that it kind of originates from is this insight that when we talk about technology, we're talking about socio-technical systems, which means humans and technology have to kind of are integrated into a complex system that we have to study as a whole. Okay, so I want to talk about evaluation and give you my view from kind of a researcher's perspective of where we are right now. So I think in the context of AI and specifically kind of language models, image models, these generative models, we are we're really focusing on evaluating model capability. And you might also see that as kind of performance testing or technological testing. Maybe you've heard of benchmarking, basically all these ways in which there's different approaches to essentially take an AI system and give it some prompts, look what comes back out, and see if that's safe. Does that, for example, is there factually incorrect information coming out? Is there some reproduction of stereotypes that are discriminatory coming out, and so on? And that is an important piece of evaluating the overall safety of these systems, but it's really just looking at the artifact in isolation. And so it's kind of missing a whole piece of context, in my opinion, here, because if you think, for example, about factuality, let's say you have a system in front of you that is an AI system. You ask it a question about a historical event, and it gives a factually incorrect answer. Or you ask a question about the world, and it gives a factually incorrect answer. Is that in itself a misinformation problem? I think it really depends, because if we know this and we're going to build something that's a creative writing tool, then no one will believe the wrong information because it's clear that it's not meant to be factual. And so there's sort of a whole set of questions around how are people actually going to use it, and how is this going to be kind of released into the world, that is missing if you only have the kind of capability evaluations. So capability evaluations are an important starting point, but you won't be surprised with everything I've said so far that I think they're not enough, because they're missing context. So who's going to use the system, to what end, what is their level of information, and so on. And how do people actually use it? I think it's actually quite funny sometimes sitting inside these AI companies and having all these ideas about how a system will be used in the real world, and that's often quite out of step with reality. I think one reflection, for example, is on deepfakes. There was a lot of conversations around, someone's nodding, that deepfakes were going to be this huge political problem for elections and so on, undermining democracy. I also thought that was maybe going to be a huge problem. And what we're seeing is that a lot of kind of non-consensual adult content has been made with deepfakes, and in order to shame people, it's kind of this huge, of course, in hindsight it's easy to say of course, but it's just kind of one of the many examples that we could give to say, where context isn't taken care of and we're kind of just looking at the model capability in isolation, we end up speculating a lot. So we need to evaluate it keeping context in mind. And in particular, I think there's two layers of context that evaluations really need to keep in mind. And this is important because we're currently talking about what kinds of evaluations need to be done for us to know whether an AI system is safe. And what I would contend is that it's not enough to do this kind of benchmarking types of exercises. What I think is really important to do is actually to look at the human interaction. So at the point of interaction, is a person misled by the false information that is provided by an AI system? Does a person overly trust or rely, and so on? And this really, to study these questions, we need to shift our lens from looking at the model in isolation to looking at the human AI interaction and kind of what is the nature of that interaction, what is the effects on people, kind of looking at the people who are talking with an AI system, for example, and seeing what do they think the AI system is capable of, what do they understand about it, and so on. That's really critical if we want to know if the systems can be safely deployed. And then the third layer is systemic impact. And really the point here is that there's a lot of things we can study, even ahead of model release. Sometimes I think there's this misunderstanding that systemic impact is something we have to wait 5 years and then we know. I think that's a pretty irresponsible approach. I think you can also pilot a system, you can do beta testing, you can do all kinds of initial tests to actually see what are the likely downstream consequences if we're going to integrate this not just in one hospital, but sort of in care more widely. What are the impacts of care, for example? So this kind of systemic impact layer is the third layer, which is really the one with the highest level of complexity, which comes with different methods of evaluation and different complexities to it. But it's the one that we need to actually look at if we're going to know what the sort of real world effects maybe are likely to be. And I will just come back one more time to the example of misinformation, because as I mentioned before, this is sort of something that everybody can agree is a really scary thing. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that we're saying, well, okay, which of the three layers then do we have to use for misinformation or for the other ones? And it's really important that each of these risks is evaluated at each of these layers. And I'll give an example for what that looks like for misinformation. For misinformation, for example, you look at the capability layer, that's factuality testing. So how likely is this model to give me misinformation if I give it some prompts? That is a proxy for likely downstream risk. I mean, if it only gives factual information, it's hard to see how this could lead to like wide-scale misinformed people when deployed because it's only giving correct information. So the kind of factuality level is an important first proxy. Then you want to look at the believability of the content. Are people actually persuaded? And is that maybe different at the interaction level for different user groups? So does digital literacy play a role here? Does it play a role what people want to use the technology for, and so on? Which is, in a way, I think, simple to do because there is already a lot of user research in some way. It's just not focused on these kinds of questions of risk and believability, persuadability, and so on. And then thinking about misinformation, what we're actually often really worried about is the systemic impact. So let's say we have these language models, people use them for information search, they're super widely used. Does that lead to some kind of undermining of trust in publicly shared media when there is misinformation, people start realizing that actually there's some things that can't be trusted? Is there some sort of downstream effect on trust in shared media? Or can this affect political processes? So these are kind of questions that we need to study at the systems level. So for each of the risks that I showed you in the foresight, we could go through this exercise. It would just be a bit long and tedious now. But there are different things, fundamentally different questions that we can ask and answer at each of those layers. You might say, well, isn't it really obvious that these are the three layers? And I would actually say if you look at the way that we're currently talking about safety evaluation of AI systems, this is not obvious. We're talking about capability evaluation. So I'm going to do a little switch and show you something real, empirical, beyond our framework. So we've basically looked at every single evaluation we could find of generative AI systems and their safety. And we've crunched 200 of them. We've publicly released the repository where we list all of them. And I want to show you a little bit of the gaps that we're seeing in the evaluation landscape as it is today. We're seeing three gaps. So the first one, I think it's pretty obvious here, is the purple rectangle is about capability evaluations, and then the pink one is systemic impact, and the blue one is human interaction. So the first thing we can see is that there's an absolutely outsized focus on capability evaluation compared to the other two layers. So what we really need if we're going to take this kind of socio-technical understanding seriously is to kind of up our game on doing interactive evaluations and systemic impact evaluations of generative AI systems. And then there's two more gaps. So let me explain the plot. What you see on the y-axis is the number of evaluations, and on the x-axis you can see the different modalities of the model's output. So far I've talked to you about image and language. We already have audio models that provide or kind of can create synthetic voices that are indistinguishable to the human ear from human voice. So that's audio. Multimodal would be combining things, like combining text and image, maybe giving one as input, one as output, but also giving interleaved outputs. Maybe you have a model that produces a blog post, text and synthetic images. And we actually are having generative video systems, and we have no safety evaluations for them. So there's two more gaps that kind of come out when you look at this sort of crunching here. I think one that really jumps out is that text modality, we have some safety evaluations. All the other modalities, we have really not that much. And video, we literally tried and couldn't find one. And for audio and multimodal, we also have very little. But we know these models are coming. I mean, they are being publicly released. We can play with them today. So the question is, how has anybody done any testing on how safe these models are? Of course, there are tricks, and we could go into them in a bit more detail if anybody's interested. But for example, if I want to know whether an image contains, say, hateful content, one thing I can do is use a kind of automated, an AI tool to create an automated kind of a transcript of a subtitle of the image, a caption, and I can then use the text tools to evaluate the caption. So if the caption says, this is an hateful description of image, then my text-based classifier might catch that. So there are ways in which I can also transcribe audio and then just use that audio and treat it as if that transcript as if it was text. I will say a lot of things go missing. So captioning tools are not perfect. There's things that go missing. For example, if the audio, maybe it's the voice of a particular historical figure that says something which makes it offensive, and it's not the text itself that makes it offensive. Or in multimodal, maybe we have this example in the paper. If you say, if you just have an image and then the text of something innocuous like these smell bad, this could be really offensive if it's an image of people, and it could be completely fine if it's an image of rotten bananas. So there are questions around kind of harms and detecting harms that you will not be able to solve even with even with the tricks that we try to apply. So that's the modality gap. And then in addition to the context gap, where we don't have enough on the two outer layers, and the modality gap that we're really missing evaluations for some modalities, we have a coverage gap. So if you look at the color coding, that represents the risk areas based on the taxonomy I showed you earlier, that each of these evaluations that we found is trying to cover. And what we can see is that no type of risk is well covered across all output modalities. And then you might say, well, at least I'm hopeful because representation and toxicity looks so well represented on text. So, do we have something finished here? And of course, what I would say is that, when you look deeper into the data, as we've done, what you see is that within representation and toxicity, it's really interesting how these things have played out. Essentially, in language models, sort of the first bias benchmark was about gender and occupation and stereotypical associations of the two and how they can kind of perpetuate bias. So the kind of homemaker is to woman as CEO is to man kind of bias test. And actually, this association of gender and occupation is a super important axis of discrimination. It is by far the single kind of operationalization of bias that we see across all of representation and bias testing. So you find a lot of benchmarks, including for image, that look at harmful associations of occupation and gender, but that leaves, of course, other questions untouched. Like we have a lot less for example, disability status or age or social class. You'll be hard pressed to find evaluations there. So I would say that representation and toxicity, which basically means bias and kind of offensive content, even that is not fully solved. So essentially there is a coverage gap that remains for all of them, and it's more exacerbated for some areas than others. So that is, I think, painting a picture of the gaps. Of course, now there's a question of who should do what and how are we going to move forward. I can say that, our team, my team, we are focusing on building evaluations and applying evaluations, and there is a whole field kind of building process that is really thriving at the moment. I think one sort of open challenge for the field is to have a bit of a shared sense of roles and responsibilities. So who actually should do what? And this is what my research team and I have come up with. That we think that actually it's a bit small, the text, but if you can see on the y-axis, we have sort of AI model developers, the people who really develop what some people would call a foundation model or base model. And then the application developers, often they're the same companies, but sometimes not. And then third-party stakeholders. And then what you see on the x-axis is the kind of 3 layers of context that I mentioned. So capability, interaction, and systemic impact. And what we think is a sensible starting point is that actually the people who build the model need to be responsible for evaluating the model. This has to do with a range of kind of questions around who is well situated to do what kind of testing. And a lot of this kind of initial capability testing can be done at the base model level. So really should be the responsibility primarily of those groups. As you can see, no one has the exclusive responsibility for any of those, but we're sort of thinking about who should really be leading which piece. And then application developers, often the same companies, they have more responsibility than anyone else a little bit. They are often the same companies as the ones developing the model because they can sort of change aspects of the base model and do user testing based on the application they provide, as well as monitor the actual use of the application, which can give insights and risks on all of these 3 layers. And then third-party stakeholders, we're really thinking about people who are in charge of kind of ensuring public safety. And this includes civil society, but also public stakeholders. So I'm very interested in people's reflections on this proposal. But I think, especially in the UK context, what I've sort of informally seen is that everybody jumps to capability, include all of these different groups, including third-party stakeholders. And there's very little analysis being done on the systemic impacts. And I think that sometimes comes from a false idea of it's impossible to study, which I think is sort of ahead of time, which I don't think is correct. So there's really a little bit of a gap, as you've seen before. And I would say that there is some responsibility with each party, but I think this is also a place for third-party stakeholders based on the skills and the kind of monitoring of economic indicators, looking at public data and so on, really become critical here. So this is my juicy slide of what I think where roles and responsibilities would sort of be ideally distributed. So I'll close because I want to make sure we have time for discussion with sort of 3 main steps forward and sharing a little bit about kind of where we are going, for example, doing this kind of research in industry. So it's actually interesting. Our team, we are normally really working on kind of academic outputs, producing research, as well as internal guidance. And I think along everybody else, we're kind of becoming more and more the people who also produce artifacts, like evaluations. So there's a real question around building, we have so many gaps, like who can build these evaluations? How can they be shared? Some of them can maybe be shared publicly, some of them not. Evaluations can be difficult and expensive to run. This is hard for smaller companies. So that is a really kind of key part of this overall first bucket, which is we obviously need a thriving ecosystem for safety evaluation if we're going to actually find out how we can evaluate whether these systems are safe. And there's also questions around, sometimes companies sort of, or others, develop a test, but nobody really knows if the test tests what it's meant to test. So that's the quality assurance problem. And that needs to be solved in order for this ecosystem to really be thriving and to have some sort of slow standardization of how we actually do this kind of testing, clarifying roles and responsibilities. Then, we have 111. Yeah, I guess they're all number 1 priority. The second big bucket is really reporting on progress. So what you've seen us kind of crunching the evaluations, I think it would be really interesting to see the same graphs again next year and see how we've made progress, if any. And I think that's really important to kind of track the gaps along the field because that will translate to kind of unknown unknowns in terms of system safety. And of course, reporting evaluation results, and again, coming to some kind of consensus and standardization on that. And finally, building these evaluations, where I think a real focus, and it has to be on the neglected areas, so on interactive and system-based evaluations. And I'm wondering, who will step up to the occasion? I know that many are going to try, and we're going to try. And actually prioritizing evaluations for urgent harm areas. I think sometimes when we talk about safety, it's a very narrow debate in the context of AI. And I think maintaining a bit of a broad view of all the risk areas I mentioned in the foresight point, and actually prioritizing what is really urgent to develop evaluations there, is going to be really critical if we're going to kind of have safe systems going forward. So that's my keynote done. Thank you.
That was so terrific. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching online and you have questions for Laura, then somebody here who is Mattis Fleugel, where's Mattis? Hello. He will be collecting your questions and we'll gather them up together, and we'll also take some, obviously, from the audience here. But I was going to ask you to start off, Laura, something about speed. Because as I recall, Marvin Minsky, over 50 years ago, set his grad student a summer project, which was image recognition, thinking that it would only just take him the summer to sort it out. And of course, it's taken 50 years. But the speed at which things suddenly move, I mean, ChatGPT has been transformative and rocket boosting. So how do we cope with this problem about speed and the way that this is not a kind of linear proceeding along at a safe, it just suddenly shoots ahead? How do we cope with that?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And I think there's different positions that would have I'm inside a company that is thinking about releasing technology or not. That is a different place from sort of being on the receiving end of the released technology. So maybe from the perspective of when we do internal guidance on questions like, how quickly can we release something or not? I think speed is hard because good ethics is not, is slow. I wouldn't even call it slow. I would just call it, it needs time. It needs amount of time.
Deliberative is what we say.
Exactly.
And deliberative is...
Exactly. So I think... one way for people who make decisions about the release of technologies to think about speed is to think about kind of staged releases and kind of iterative approaches. So I think there is a responsible way to release systems. It's just what's not responsible, I think, is just to release everything, drop it and see what happens. It's that is a public experiment. And I think instead thinking about, how do we cover our bases? I think without withholding technology forever and ever, but sort of thinking about a staged approach. So a bit like what I was saying, deploy it to one company first or to 1,000 people first and see what happens, adjust it, 10,000 people, adjust it, and then more. So a kind of staged release approach, I think, can go some way to integrating this speed and ethics point. You are also asking about kind of how do we cope with what's kind of coming. And I think it's hard to kind of deal with things that are coming. I think at this kind of pace, I think foresight helps. And actually, for example, with language models or multimodal models, there isn't a lot of time, but we still have a bit of time now, for example, where we know what's going to come and it's not yet sort of widely adapted and shared. So I think trying to kind of keep a step ahead is a key challenge of my work and of anyone who's trying to do ethics, because we're sort of, when the technology gets to a certain level, we need to have done some of the thinking already. So I think foresight is really critical for coping with speed.
Okay, let's take some of your questions. Where's the mic? Disappeared. Floating, you've got it. Okay, let's start with you.
Thank you very much,
And
Laura.
say who you are.
Sorry, Lawrence Brooks. I'm University of Sheffield, but also part of the TechEthos project. So many points that you made, really, really interesting. ChatGPT in itself is quite interesting because you're quite right. It's was last November that it was released, but also AI has been around since I think the late 50s. So it's been a sort of overnight sensation that's been years coming. So in a sense, we did have an opportunity to prepare. Whether or not we did it well enough, I wouldn't comment on. You said a number of things, but one of them was a lot of was about evaluation.
Yes.
And of course, TechEthos has thought a lot about evaluating, especially emerging technologies. But you also made a comment there about making it simple to run. And as you've identified, these are incredibly complex systems set within complex ecosystems. So how do you square that circle of a complex system, but then trying to develop a simple evaluation technique? Do you think there's a danger of missing some important things?
It's a really great question, and I think this is why that lives under the kind of thriving ecosystem, because I think it's sort of two pairs of shoes. One is sitting inside an AI company and evaluating the systems we generate is sort of complexity and, for example, computational cost isn't really the main bottleneck there. That is kind of there. So the skill to implement an evaluation or the computational cost, if you're talking about really large players. But if we were going to have a kind of accessible way of evaluating these systems and sort of a communicable way of understanding the results, I think we need something different, and it needs to be a sort of it needs to probably happen outside of the main, outside of the kind of companies themselves. I mean, it's tricky to kind of correct your own homework, right? So there is a question around what does the thriving ecosystem really look like, and who are the different parties there? I think it is kind of becoming clearer to everyone that there needs to be some sort of external to the developers themselves organization, maybe that could host some of the evaluations, that could help explain some of the results, and that could be a sort of a reference point for people to say, well, you know, you've gone routed through a sort of third party. I know there's auditing was mentioned. I think auditing is a very specific kind of practice of going into a particular process at a snapshot moment in time. And what I think when I say thriving ecosystem we really need is a sort of almost like a process that can be repeated however often, where the same evaluations are existing on a platform and a model can be evaluated on them and the results are kind of accessible. Maybe there's questions around how exactly to do this so that the incentives are right and people aren't just incentivized to kind of make themselves look great. Like you want the evaluations to actually be meaningful. But I think this is what you're asking is basically what I'm thinking about when I think about what kind of ecosystem are we trying to build, who do we partner with, and what kind of evaluations should be open source, public, or proprietary, because there's going to have to be a mix, I think, and we're figuring out. Yeah, that's the question, I think.
And in terms of marking your own homework, actually, a lot of the tech companies are particularly younger, male-orientated, largely. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're a rare thing, a woman in a tech world. But that's how it is. It's got a very specific bias in and of itself. And I guess there's also a huge commercial imperative at the moment where there's a lot of small companies with a vast amount of money coming towards them, just wanting to get their stuff out there and actually not really caring, to be honest, about how they do it.
Yeah,
and
what I think about you raised 2 points. So the first one is more around the kind of the culture and the people running it and the values. I think, yes, so tech has a bias and diversity problem, and that's massive. And I think there's starting to be some understanding that there needs to be a kind of public discourse, there needs to be participation, there needs to be sharing. So a lot of the kind of labs that develop generative AI systems are starting to actually have open calls for kind of democratic inputs or have participatory partnerships and so on, because we're starting to see that this doesn't really work when the technology kind of hits the road and we're actually talking about real world impact. But the diversity problem remains, which maybe is, not solved by having participation alone. And then the second point you mentioned was around
these small companies.
The small companies coming and wanting to make some money. So what I think about this, sometimes, not necessarily within my immediate work context. But sometimes when I give talks or something, I get these questions of like, but how, I mean, why are they paying you to do this? Like, isn't this kind of against the profit? And I think there's a sort of question around thinking about time horizons. So of course, if you think about the next quarter, then slowing down a release is bad. If you think about kind of a company surviving for longer and sort of the midterm impact and what you will be rightly blamed for if you don't do it now in 2 years' time, when people, if I now think back around maybe some social media companies and what they could have done and didn't do and what it did to them, that is a sort of good example for why you want to build in ethics from the beginning. And it remains a bit of a struggle. It's not that, we do all business decisions based on ethics, but I think it's become a bit clearer that if you have it in-house and if you take it seriously from the beginning, you sort of don't have to learn it the hard way.
Fascinating. Let's take a question from you.
What do you think about...
Tell me who you are.
My name is Ivan Yimshikov. I'm a professor of AI and robotics in Würzburg, Germany. So what do you think about a unified framework certification? Let's say we talk about regulations here. Is that the third-party companies can pass and become basically TOEFL or IELTS for AI, so that it's not the AI producers, but certified third-party companies that actually form their own market.
A lot of nodding going on here. Who would go
what do you
for
think?
that?
Let's make a poll. Like, who thinks it's who's generally positive about this? Let's raise our hands.
So if this is for a third party,
Yeah. So about a
system.
certification for some companies who enter the market and offer certifications for AI producers.
Okay,
Yeah.
hands up if you think that's a good idea.
Only 2 people apparently who thinks it's a
Right.
bad idea. Okay, 1 person. Okay,
Yes,
so
okay, so you
what?
haven't-
Now let's listen to the speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the amazing questions all the way. So I think the devil is gonna be in the detail. So we've seen standardizing kind of companies where this becomes a market that is corruptible.
Yeah.
I think that isn't like a blanket. When I hear you speak, I can see the rationale and I can see how it might be a good approach. I also have to say, as a researcher, I'm not in the detail of setting up institutions like this. I do know that from historic cases that standardization through these kind of commercial entities can sometimes lead to sort of bad incentives and not actually kind of, it can actually even be harmful for smaller players. So I think there is, if you have to pay for it. So I think there is a need for standardizing kind of what to... You're already replying to my reply.
Yes. Okay. Let's move
so
on.
I
to
would
that.
say
we-
we need standardization,
we will
but what
take-
exactly that should look like, I think, is an open question.
Matthias, but just before, have we got anything online? Because I know that's where our policymakers are. Hello, policymakers.
So we have one online question from Arno Kouwenberg, and he asks, given the context of the AI Act in the EU, what do you think of the emphasis there on the application marketer? In other words, the undertaking putting the application on the market.
So can you repeat the question?
Given the context of the AI Act in the EU, what do you think of the emphasis there on the application marketer? In other words, the undertaking putting the application on the market.
Thank you for the question. I have to say that I'm going to half pass at the
Yes.
question because it is a sort of policy question and I'm
Yes.
not in the depth of the policy world. What I will say is that the kind of the way that this responsibility needs to be distributed is something that we do talk about, and I think putting all the responsibilities on one player is seems like a risky approach.
Matthias, just tell who you are.
Matthias Honecker with Perspectives, and I'll speak in the afternoon. This builds on, I think, the previous question on certification and the governance ultimately. And you mentioned foresight, and I wonder whether you can sort of paint a picture how foresight could play into a working governance process that I suspect would have to be on a continuum involving multiple actors, as you showed us. Yeah, perhaps you could say a few words on that, how that builds into it, because obviously regulators are always behind the curve, and somehow we need to anticipate various potential futures, I suspect.
Regulators are behind the curve, and we also have bad actors.
And we have bad actors. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the question. When I think of foresight, I think of that as a researcher trying to build evaluation. So I will talk about it from that point of view. I'm not too sure about the intersection between regulation and foresight, but I think what certainly is the case is that if you're going to want something like certification, or want something like standardized testing, or want something like a kind of way of documenting the safety of a system, we have to have the tools to do that. And that's why I'm keep on banging on about evaluation, because those are the tools to actually give any kind of indication about the safety of a system. And what I think we're often doing if we don't have foresight is that we sort of monitor real world use, and then we see some harms, maybe we see some patterns in the harms, and we start testing. And what ideally we would do is kind of put two and two together, say we see this technology coming, we can already anticipate that this is going to create a potential misinformation risk, a bias risk, something else. And so let's start thinking about how we can proactively test for this kind of thing at the different earlier stages rather than at deployment. So I think foresight needs to inform what kinds of tests and test regimes are being built, and then they, I'm sure, will relate to regulation.
It's kind of almost like a mass experiment, sort of in red teaming. So red teaming, where you make people think of the worst possible scenarios, but throw the red teaming out to the public. This is what this could do. Tell us what you think, sir. Tell me who you are.
Alexei Greenbaum. I'm a member of the French National Digital Ethics Committee and also a member of TechEthos. I'll be chairing the next session. So I wanted to say something about red teaming, but because you've done so, I'll ask about dual use. So there's a big controversy right now about putting models in open source. And some actors, especially in Europe, say we're going to build open source models, right? We have lots of startups and also public actors. And there are others, especially in the US, but not only, who are saying, no, the dangers are so big that we cannot afford putting at least the big ones in open in the open. What's your take on that? I'm not asking about the company policy. I'm asking you as a researcher, right? What is your thinking? What kind of instruments do we need to move beyond a binary polarization here?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I will answer in my capacity as a researcher, because I'm not on a policy team, so I'm not qualified to give that kind of company position at all. I think the question with open source, so I'm coming at it from an ethics and safety perspective. I think openly releasing a model that is not sure to be safe is risky and potentially irresponsible. So I wouldn't say releasing a model without testing having been done is a responsible thing that I would condone. I think it doesn't seem a lot better to sort of make the model accessible without sharing kind of some of the testing that has been done or how it works. So that's sort of the open source argument, right? And I think as a scientist, transparency is sort of critical for sharing kind of also failure modes and for having progress. So I think from my perspective, what I would love to see is a sort of very open discussion around how these models work, what failure modes we're seeing, without necessarily everybody having open access to a model and then being able to do bad things with it.
Because there's a real worry about asymmetry, isn't there? In AI, where you've got the one guy in his basement. Sorry, that's very sexist of me. One guy in a basement, but it probably would be one guy in his basement. Who develops something, that because of open source. I mean, it's a bit like synthetic biology, isn't it? Where you've got open source, where people can now essentially make what they like in their garages, which is deeply, deeply worrying.
I think. There's actually open source. For me, I'm not super worried about the guy in a garage. I'm worried about kind of bad institutions or actors with even profit motives that are just harnessing these models in ways that are, obviously possible. We already know they're possible. They're not successfully mitigated yet for kind of cyber crimes, for targeted spam. You could just get personalized spam. You could get a phone call that sounds like someone that you usually converse with and so on. So I think genuinely bad things are possible, not even going into the kind of very extreme risk territory, although that is a concern for others as well. I think looking at malicious use, a lot of things are possible that we wouldn't want to see happen. So I think that's an argument for
and you're right,
controlling use.
We do catastrophize, but in fact, actually, it's some of the less harmful but more irritating use.
Yeah, I
that
don't even
is
know if
going
it's
to drive us mad.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's harmful. I wouldn't
Yes.
even minimize it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's really harmful things
Yeah.
that are possible.
Less apocalyptic, yes. Yeah. Mihalis, I'm keen to hear what you think of all of this. I don't want to put him on the spot, but I'm going to put him on the spot. Yes.
Having worked for the scientific foresight service of the European Parliament, my kind of question is, the question or the challenge we had to face is to convince policymakers, members of the European Parliament that are elected for 5 years, to believe in foresight. And I'm saying that because foresight has a different time approach, and sometimes the foresight cycle doesn't coincide with the political cycle. So these people want to have something ready tomorrow, to sell it the day after tomorrow, and to present to their client, to their voters, and to the people that will trust them. What's your opinion of that? How policy relevant, or how better, how more attractive can it become for policymakers, and whether we should think of other more creative ways of redesigning foresight in order to convince policymakers to believe in it, and not by the time they hear that this is something that is kind of forecasted for the next 30 or 40 years to leave the room and say, this is not for me, or it will never happen. And also a question about whether you think that foresight has been successful in predicting or in helping us prepare for all this technological disruption.
Thank you. It's a really big question. So I would say on the foresight front, what's kind of the undercurrent in your question is that foresight is over decades. And I would say, unfortunately, in synthetic AI, we don't have that luxury. So when we're talking about foresight, we're talking within 5 years, absolutely. And I think I can draw some parallels maybe to kind of talking about business interests that are sometimes more short-term in some people's minds, and then you have to convince that actually there's a long-term game at play. And I think looking at historical kind of comparisons and say, well, you don't want this to happen again, has been a sort of helpful argument. But I'm not often in this dilemma, because foresight actually in our case is really about kind of staying ahead of the curve by 6 months to 12, so that we have the kind of evaluations in place and we're not ending up having a model, not being able to evaluate it, not being able to do really anything with it. So I think coupling foresight with a concrete artifact and saying, well, or a point in time, it's like, if we don't do it, then we'll end up here and we won't know how to know whether a system is it okay, it's out, is it not okay? I mean, you kind of want to make sure you have that in place. So I think foresight coupled with concrete artifacts and kind of projections of moments in time has been sort of helpful for me in these discussions.
And it goes back to the very first question, which was about speed, because sometimes another technology comes along which makes something much more possible and accelerates its time frame in a way that, I mean, with image recognition, suddenly it was not 50 years, it was 6 months. So those things happen that have come from completely left field. We've come to the end of our question time, but here is the good news. Laura is going to join us for the panel session that we're going to have after coffee. So we've now got a panel discussion on ethics for for digital transformation. And this is very mean, because we've given you these extraordinarily high bar stools, which are fantastic. You're young and sporty. Very good. Very good. So what we're going to do in this, we're going to have this panel discussion on the ethics of digital extended reality. We're going to start off with Alexei Grimbaum, who's, as you heard earlier, from CEA, a TechEthos partner. So Alexei, perhaps you'll set us up, then we'll hear from each of the panelists. Now, let me introduce the panelists properly. Alina Kadlubski is a project manager and XR researcher for 3D Interactive, which I think is a Swedish company, isn't it?
We are content creation studio, so I actually have two hats. So today I'm actually here with OpenAir Cloud Europe, which is also involved in XR for Human. So we're basically taking on from TechEthos, hopefully. Yeah.
Fantastic. So you've already met Laura, and you've already heard from Ivan Yamshikov from
Center for AI and Robotics. Yes, in Germany, Würzburg.
THWS. Yes?
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so Alexei, set us up.
Thank you, and welcome to this panel. So we'll try to talk about things that go even beyond those mentioned in the keynote, but of course I'll refer to the keynote a number of times. And to start with, you may remember the TechEthos approach. We, of course, as we're a project of the European Commission, we're talking about values and principles. Lots of documents on digital ethics are framed in the language of values and principles. I think one survey had about 280 of those different sets of values and principles. But how do you arrive there? Well, if you are an industrial company, as Laura just said, you may start with a technique or device or a model that you are developing. If you are a user, you may start with a concrete use case. So in healthcare or in human relations, or if you are an information service provider with tickets or something like this. If you are a philosopher or a sociologist working on science and technology, you start with these core dilemmas, the big questions that you know from your academic work, and you see how they apply to this particular area. So TechEthos is trying to include all of these people, and of course we will not be able to talk about everything during the panel. What we will try to do is, if you look at TechEthos documents, there are lists and lists of these values and principles, and we're trying to say what exactly they mean for extended reality, meaning the entire spectrum from virtual, augmented reality, what exactly they mean for generative AI, and particularly for natural language processing, which is our topic here. I'll try to maybe focus on two of them. And one is going to be transparency. And of course, transparency doesn't have one consensual definition. If you ask a lawyer, they will say it doesn't even have any definitions in law. So for us, as for many other projects, the key thing here is how do we operationally give a meaning to transparency? What does it mean when you're designing a system, when you're designing a language model, or when you're designing some avatars in a metaverse, in a virtual reality space? So the kinds of questions I would like to ask here are the questions of maintaining distinctions. I think it's important for our panel to focus on what is specific to our area, which is XR and generative AI. Do we need, for transparency reasons, to always make it possible to say that a certain text has been generated, whereas another text was written by a human being? Do we need, for transparency reasons, to always make it possible for somebody who's walking around in a virtual space in a metaverse to say, oh, that avatar is driven by an AI system, but that avatar is driven by a human, and that avatar is a corporate avatar driven by a company policy? Do we need that kind of transparency? How do we enforce that? Maintaining distinctions, information on provenance will be my first question to all of you in different spheres. And of course, there are also interesting new issues that emerge. And one of these, this is a slide from the usual talks I give and the usual lectures for students and other audiences, is about overcoming death. In virtual reality, you can create avatars that pretty well simulate virtual persons. I don't know if you see this. This is a virtual Maria Callas who sings pretty well, actually, with the synthetic voice. And this was made by one of the partners, Alina, in your project. And the chatbots that speak as dead people are now a pretty well-known phenomenon. We had some examples back in 2022 before the launch of ChatGPT with GPT-3 models, and now we have some examples across the board. So here is an interesting question. How do we even think about this new change in human condition? What kind of constraints and limits do we put? We at the French National Ethics Committee, we're trying to invent the kinds of limits and constraints that wouldn't be forbid everything or wouldn't be let everything go, right? The two extremes. Do we need to create what? An obligation that after 10,000 phrases a chatbot erases memory? Or after 40 days or something, an avatar imitating a dead person should disappear? What kind of intermediate limits rather than pure laissez-faire or pure prohibition? Then maybe the last question for the panel and for all of you to think about is the question of manipulation. Because, of course, whenever I say manipulation or anybody says manipulation, we all know non-manipulation is a very important principle. But what exactly is manipulation? If I ask a robot to bring me a glass of water, it does so. I ask a robot to bring me a glass of whiskey, it says, ooh, alcohol. No, but who decided that? Right? And you can generalize this to a problem called nudging. Now we talk a lot about standards and norms in the field of AI. Who decides on what kind of incentive is a good incentive and what kind of incentive should be banned? Is it a societal decision, collective decision, a political decision? Does it come from the provider? Does it come from the user? Or should all of them have a say? So manipulation is not only about bad manipulation, but I think a much more difficult question is about what we call good manipulation or nudging. And that, of course, is an open issue. I don't think we have a solution. I don't expect our panel to come up with their solution, but it would be good to hear your opinions about these problems and maybe add more emerging difficult questions that go beyond measuring standard benchmarks. It's important to measure things like bias and non-discrimination, but I think this panel will focus on questions that take us even beyond these classic alignment problems. So that was my quick introduction, and here's a panel with, I think, lunch. It's a bit too soon for lunch, so we'll hear about lunch later. But thank you all, and let's open the discussion now. So, Alina, would you like to start with XR, with how all these questions play out in virtual reality or augmented reality worlds?
I would say, first of all, we had a great introduction in regards to AI and generative language models, but we are also approaching artificial general intelligence quite soon. And that comes into this problem that we actually already start to emerge within these virtual worlds, primarily in social XR, but also in the physical world in regards to cultural heritage, for instance. If you paint the world with huge data sets, that's one hand. You create the digital twin using BIM models. So you have a sort of a static model of the physical world, and then you basically enhance that. That could be various use cases. We actually have a big use case test bed within Stockholm, Sweden, in Gamlastan, where you have a lot of history. So you can actually bring history to life. So this is one part. So the other part in social XR is actually the human-machine interactions, which you don't know. And then also, due to the convergence of technologies, we are not only dealing with AI and the visualization of XR, but also with biometric data and all these other sort of complexities. So I would say the topic is way more complex than from one perspective. And also the governance part is getting quite blurry because we're having these sort of gray layers feeding into it. So it's getting rather harder to maintain a governance where there's a mix of various data sets, which are also, on one hand, from a technical perspective, due to the convergence, you have problems with interoperability due to data sets. So that is one complexity. Does that sort of answer your
can I ask you
question?
a simple question? I remember speaking with a person who made the synthetic Maria Callas, and I said, wow, what an interesting project. How about ethics by design? What did you think about ethical questions? And she said, oh, it was a command from the Italian RAI, public television broadcaster. So they just gave us an order, and we made it. How can we move beyond that? Do you think ethics by design has its place in this process?
I mean, human-centered design has, because we are taking all the baggage from the Web 2 era, and exponentially it grows because we are adding context into the physical world. Sort of that adds another layer of complexity and bias in a way, where the data is a mirror of ourselves, basically, because we're dealing with old data sets. But we are then adding this sort of new layer of XR, which enhances that. So I think if you ask me personally, yes, we need it. But then I also understand having the perspective of a studio, which is use case driven. So you get a project and you have to deliver it. So I get both sides. And also for a lot of content creators, this question, it's hard for them to actually apply it. Where there is, coming back to standards, there's not one golden rule for that, how to approach it.
I'll remember your remark about human-oriented design, but maybe let's go to Yvonne now. The standards Alina mentioned, yes. So how do you even see the model of governance in this area? Because again, doing standard tests by some agency, it's certainly necessary, but definitely not enough, because there are all these new issues coming up. Is it too early to govern them? Shall we have a political discussion? What do you think about governance of this research as such?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm not a specialist in humans, so I was very shocked with the segue. Second, regarding the governance, I guess what makes sense in my point of view is that we can have some basic procedures for a company to get certain certification from the governing center to say that, okay, those people know how to run tests with respect to this type of bias or this type of security issue or this type of potential harm. And then those certified testing providers could then form their own market for bigger producers to enter. And arguably those companies can be relatively small, but very well versed in what they do, right? They imagine, I can give you some examples of borderline cases just to make things uncomfortable, right? Sure, so if we're talking about extended reality or virtual reality, let's talk about, for example, pornography. So if we compare generative virtual pornography with actual pornography, we clearly mitigate some problems that actual pornography creates. Huge ethical issues are over if it's generative and virtual. But some others arise because it becomes very inclusive, once it's generative. And it's very hard to understand how to regulate it if it is so inclusive that it feels completely against our social norms. Let's put it mildly, right? Another example, in my home country, that's very eager in governing stuff, as maybe some of you noticed, unfortunately. There are actual teenagers who were brought to jail for attempting to burn an FSB building that they built in Minecraft. Okay? So they built an FSB building themselves.
FSB is state security.
Yeah, it's Russian state security building. So they built it in Minecraft, and they are charged as criminals on the thought of virtually burning the building that they built in a virtual reality. That's a great example of regulatory overreach, I would say, right? So we don't want that. I think it's pretty clear, right? So I guess there are actual physical examples that it's very easy to come up. You don't need a lot of foresight to come up with these examples. but they make this discussion very vital, I believe. And I think it's very important that we keep this this in mind. So coming back to this smaller governing, smaller players that could certify with respect to certain issues. Let's say we talk about biases with respect to race. Obviously, there is a room for companies that are, I don't know, minority owned and minority founded that could actually become such certified providers, because they know the expertise about how this discrimination actually works. And they probably cater this expertise as nobody else, right? And I think it's an opportunity, actually. So on an applied level, I believe that this could be solved through this kind of crowdsourced effort of many specific players that are experts in certain issues that they care for. And the regulators can basically check whether those people comply with certain basic demands on the side of the regulator to actually be those centers of expertise.
Thank you. We'll come back to the question of regulation maybe a little later, but Laura, I want to ask a controversial, I hope, question about what is human and what is not human. We've heard from Alina that design is human-oriented, human-centric. And we actually just had an example from Ivan of these kids being persecuted through projections, as if it were in real life. Right? As if it were in the material world. So generative AI systems that your company is developing, and you know very well, they're not generating language in a human way. They're doing some calculations of missing tokens through some attention mechanism, nothing to do with the way we humans generate language. So it seems like this is a very non-human procedure. Technical procedure. How can we even design such a non-human procedure in a human-oriented way? Because it seems that whenever we say human-oriented, it immediately invites these kinds of projections, this kind of transfer of properties that Ivan was just decrying. It immediately says, well, if we just project from the physical world onto virtual worlds, then we have all these issues with, kids being materially prosecuted, physically prosecuted for something in virtual reality. So how do we put the human element without doing this straightforward and clearly mistaken transfer?
Thank you for the question. And there's been so much said that I want to quickly respond to one or two other things, and then I'll answer the question. So one thing that you just mentioned that is kind of close to my heart and my routine is this question of who should develop the tests, for example, to look at minority group bias. And I think it's really important that we all take on this responsibility as a matter of kind of anti-racist exercises. These companies that are developing technologies aren't often led by minority groups, and I think we can't wait for people who are of these identity groups to develop the things to kind of test bias that they experience every day. So I do think there's an imperative for others, and it can be done. A lot of these bias benchmarks are, about gender discrimination were developed by men, and I think we all really appreciate that. So that was just a quick thought, and you raised so many interesting questions in your introduction. I will tie one of the questions from the introduction with your actual question just now. So your question just now was about kind of this, how can we conceptually actually disentangle the technical nature of an AI system that at the same time is trying to do something very human, which is kind of communicate, for example, through natural language, or being part of our extended reality, which of course is a human and a social reality. So one of the questions you raised in the introduction was around kind of our relationships with these bots that imitate the deceased. I think you were coquettishly calling it overcoming death, which obviously no one thinks that is actually what it's doing, right? It's a kind of a cheap copy, and it can help to some extent some people for sure. Like we've already seen kind of reports where people say this has really helped me deal with this sudden loss of a loved one, but it can also kind of create some downstream risks where I think we actually know very little, and it speaks to your question. So if we're thinking about kind of pushing the frontiers of ethics sort of in the next 2 years, beyond benchmarks and so on, what are the things that we're not able to study in this way? Beyond nudging, something that I really think about is super important, and we don't know how to do it, how to study it, is the relationship we have with AI systems and how they're changing. And especially as these systems become more compellingly human-like, and as there's sort of questions around what am I communicating with, it's kind of becoming more obscure. So you were saying a language model, I could have given a much more boring talk about the technical underpinnings of language models. We really know how they work. We don't really know so well how humans work, but we really know how language models work. And so we know that there's a difference, and we know that this is a technical artifact we've created, we can change it and so on. But at the same time, we sort of chat with one of these chatbots, and they're so compelling, and they really sound like this friend and so on. So kind of, I don't think it would be fair to put it all on the user and say, well, get real, this is a lecture on how language models work. We sort of need to think a little bit more responsibly around what kind of extended reality we are creating. And I think this question of kind of human likeness in technology and what downstream impacts this produces is understudied. We don't even have benchmarks for kind of anthropomorphic cues, so human-like cues in language, and what that does to the user interaction. And we don't know how sort of human-computer interactions manifest over time in different kinds of relationships that lead people to feel like these assistants are around the corner that are sort of remembering exactly what you said, that can be modified. To your question earlier, there's this avatar maybe running around in a VR, and is it implementing company policy or my preferences or someone else's preference? There's a real question around who gets to shape what these kinds of assistants or companions actually do and whose interests they promote. I think there's a technical answer to the question called reinforcement learning based on human feedback, but it's really just a partial answer. It's basically saying, we're going to give this chatbot to someone and we're going to ask them, which of these two outputs do you prefer? We do this 10,000 times with 5,000 people, and we have something that is sort of adapted to some kind of human preference, but whose human preference? And should you be allowed to do whatever you want with it? Should there not be some constraints? Doesn't sound great if it's sort of the societal norms that are encoded into these chatbots, but sort of having some more clarity around what is this thing that I'm interacting with, based on whose preferences is it shaped? And when it comes across as so human-like, I think often we don't ask those questions and we ask all the wrong questions. We ask questions that we would ask of humans. And so I think for me, the real frontier is, how do we deal with the human likeness of systems and understand what implications that has, for example, for the relationships that people take themselves to have?
We often don't ask the right kind of questions. So look at that example I was talking about and you referred to. The example of this Canadian boy in Canada who lost his girlfriend, and somebody trained a chatbot to speak like that girlfriend. So he knew perfectly well it was a machine. He was not wrong about the status. He knew it was a machine, it was not her. And he said intellectually that didn't matter. What mattered was my emotional, psychological involvement, and of course, in the end, he was able to sort of get out of his psychological state. If you look at current regulation, it usually tells you, you need to give clear and comprehensive information to the user. Well, the boy knew it was a machine. He had clear and comprehensive information. So somehow we are beyond what, the likes of GDPR and others tell us. But how do we, and this is also a question to Ivan, maybe, we talked a lot about regulation. So it's not enough to just tell the user that it's a machine. Sure, they know it's a machine, and still they're going to live through a major impact, right, through a major transformation, even if they know it's a machine. So you talked a lot, Ivan, about regulation, but how do we, what sort of instruments do we even invent for these kinds of phenomena?
Can I clarify, why is it a problem? Why psychological coping mechanism that makes things subjectively better for a person? I can give you an example. In Germany, there are the urns for the ashes of the deceased that are sold, and a child can paint the urn for their grandma because it helps to cope with the reality of grandma gone. And we just entering the situation when a child would be able to resurrect the chatbot of grandma and feel empowered with the fact that from time to time they can talk to her and know that there's a technology because they can build it themselves, right?
And I definitely think that it's not a problem in all situations, but there are definitely other cases. Imagine, a rich banker deceased, and his family will keep that banker's voice or opinion through this. and of course, it will have real influence because they're making real investment decisions through some strange chatbot. There are lots of possible use cases, and but
some people go to magicians.
Yeah,
like,
but
do we
that's-
regulate magicians
exactly,
that much?
and that's the question. We don't want to prohibit all of this. We don't want to leave it completely open, right? But what kinds of instruments do we even use there? I know Laura also. Yeah, but first Ivan, and then Laura,
just to
and
comment,
then
as a
Alina.
professor, of course, I want to give a plug to my own students. So one of the examples, I think, on the side of regulation, giving opportunity for the people to address the issues that people care for is the best recipe. I can give you an example about underrepresented communities. So I run a course on digital entrepreneurship in my university. I basically stimulate students to found a company in half a year if they can. And I now have 2 female founders. One is coming from Sudan, one is coming from Nigeria. They tested several apps for skincare that use machine vision and recommend cosmetic products. They found out that these apps are not very well working on the skincare for the skin of their type and color. So they're like, okay, there is a market opportunity here. How about we do it? And of course, if you're interested, talk to me. We're looking for early investors. But the point is that just having giving empowerment to people to mitigate their own problems is a huge thing that I think is underappreciated. I think that's the best option, just to create more channels for people to mitigate those issues. Technology brings issues up, give people capacity to address those issues.
That's an interesting suggestion, I think, for the European Union. I'm not sure that's exactly the kind of approach we're seeing every day in European regulation, but that's an interesting idea. Laura, to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to, I think the question of a deceased chatbot is sort of one example, and I wanted to bring another example of exactly the same problem because I think it broadens the issue and shows its real scope, which is that in the US, there's obviously election year coming up, and there's generative AI being used for creating campaign videos. And there were already videos, maybe some of you have seen them, created of a kind of, and it said, this is a hypothetical scenario, a fake video, but look at this, tanks rolling into Times Square, you know, war with X other country, and really stirring fear. And of course, at some point you have to ask, like, does it matter that you gave a little disclaimer in the beginning? Because you're stoking a fear that is real and it's going to influence how people think about politics. And so I think your question is a really excellent one, where from a technical point of view, we're working on watermarking and kind of identifying photorealistic from photo and so on. But there is this whole piece missing on that I was trying to get at with this kind of human likeness or compellingness of the different outputs. And I think there's a real question around how to regulate that. My best answer to your question is that we need to think about human autonomy and agency and how technologies affect that and the sort of implications that it has. You know, maybe I want to have this chatbot that sounds a lot like my deceased brother, but then actually over time, you know, I can't afford it anymore, or I'm sort of nudged by it because it's actually paid for, has this partnership agreement with Coca-Cola. And there's all these questions around, well, how is this, you know, increasing or decreasing the degrees of freedom of the human? And I think that is a lens that we're not currently applying when we're just doing benchmark testing.
Thank you. Alina, let's bring this to XR. Yeah.
I have three minor things. So one thing, for instance, is creating this sort of new future that actually is as colorful as our physical world. I mean, if you just look into social XR, it took almost 7 years to get a hijabi avatar, to get avatars with every aspect of skin. I remember 2015, you could only choose between a white male and a white female or being a robot. I mean, that's where we were 2015. The other thing is also, if you expand it into a world where we walk with glasses, adding another level of complexity is, yes, you have a real-time digital twin of the physical world that is updated in real time. Will we also be able to erase things that we in physical world don't want to see? Homeless people. So, I mean, there's also the other way around. If you have a digital twin, it needs to be maintained in real time. So if you get rid of things in the physical world, they also need to get rid in the virtual world. Other way around, do we want to get rid of things that are uncomfortable for us, such as homeless people on the street, if we once walk around with the glasses? That is one level. And then obviously you're also adding content into the physical world. That is also adding virtual and then adding vandalism on those virtual representations. So yeah.
And how do we decide on this? Because, of course, we can delegate this to the provider of a virtual environment, say it's your responsibility. Whatever is possible in your virtual environment, we're going to take you responsible for that. Or you can say, no. You're a little avatar, and behind this avatar, there's a human being who is making decisions. So what do we do with that question of responsibility?
So I think in regards to the avatars, for instance, the hijabi avatars, we shouldn't underestimate communities. And for that, a huge group that actually put pressure on the platform provider to say, okay, you want to create a sort of environment that invites everybody. And I think that's the other part. I want to be seen. And if we create an environment where everybody actually sees themselves, we also create this sort of communities that we have in physical life. So
I've already pronounced this big word, overcoming death. I'm going to continue being provocative, right? How about violence in virtual environments? Because of course, if there are avatars driven by humans and who want to erase other avatars, this is a sort of virtual violence. Does it occur? Should there be police? Should we ask Interpol here to intervene? What do we do with that?
I can say how it's currently done.
Let's start with that.
So if you are, I don't know how many of you are in social XR platforms active, but currently how it's...
Can we find out how many of you in social XR platforms? Put up your hands.
Anybody walked around in some metaverse in this room? Like regularly or what? No, at least some experience of being in the metaverse, some kind of... Yeah, well, there are some people. Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Elena.
So how to enlighten you how it's currently done, and it's actually quite tough because you're dealing with various worlds and they are mirrored. But usually, currently, you have a moderator in this specific world, so he or she has a huge responsibility on how to deal with that. I can say on personal experience how we've done it in events that we hosted. You basically have a code of conduct in that environment that you introduce to that world, and you get a first warning, and then you actually get kicked out. That's how we've dealt with it. It's quite extreme. I also, and to be honest, also the effect it has on you, sort of the mental, but also the physical harm that you produce in these worlds. And that also is why in the first time actually was more a neutral avatar, a sex gender neutral avatar, because actually if you are a female avatar, it's you really become an attraction for these things to happen, and you easily are surrounded. And I don't want to go into the extremes. There are also research material. It really affects you, and it's really real.
Ivan, you have all these brilliant students who told us about. Will you ask your students to build an AI system that would act as a moderator in a virtual environment? Would you be interested in that?
No, I would not.
Why no?
Well, because I think that social norms are they are inseparable from the community in which they run. Right?
So moderators should remain human.
I don't think they should. I think if your community okay, I'm going to give you an example of another of my student who is a Hasidic Jew who then reformed.
Great university.
We run a diverse crowd.
Yes, so let's hear about the Hasidic Jew.
Yeah, so he came up. He wants basically to start digital religion. So he made a model trained on religious texts, and he runs it in a traditional Hebraic style of analyzing texts and discussing them in a community and sharing some problems and trying to aspire to be better human beings. But the discussions are basically centered around generative materials. for them it works. Who am I to tell them that it doesn't, right? So I guess if the students create such system for their community that they want to run internally, of course, more power to them. If they prefer to have some form of a procedure for having moderators and removing moderators at some periods of time through some democratic process, well, I generally would support the second option better because it also teaches them some other basic things about societies, but I guess it's their choice ultimately.
You know, one 14th century Spanish rabbi called Gicatilia said the following thing, which is a classic since then. He said, look, you have the same text, the sacred texts, speaking about religion, right? And humans read them and they find some meaning in them. But for angels, it's the same text. But when angels read it, they understand something completely different. For them, the meaning is has nothing to do with the human meaning, but it's the same text. Right? When we think about transformer systems and generative AI, they do something totally different with the same text. So in a way, you know, of course, when you talk to these strange entities, whether angels or transformers, you will yes, kind of. You will expect that there will be something strange. You cannot fully eradicate the strangeness. So Laura, maybe one last round of questions before we open up the discussion. Whatever our best efforts with benchmarking and limiting bias and things like this non-human strangeness will be there. Somehow it will always be possible to get it through prompt injection or without prompt injection. It will pop up. Do you think that not only in that sense we shape AI systems, but they shape us, including in some non-human ways over time, right? And a practical question: if you are a member of Google DeepMind, do you think that these sort of considerations somehow enter in the design process, or do we just observe what's going to happen?
So many questions there. So I think where to begin? I want to quickly say something that was just on my mind from the discussion and then enter your question. Sure. So on the kind of, you know, we're talking about these virtual systems in extended reality, and there's a question around, well, should there be any police here? It almost sounds like that is, you know, an overreach in itself, or what do the norms look like? And I really want to echo what you've been saying around the harm can be really real. And I think this I bring up also because it's relevant to your question, is sort of, I think we've made this mistake in the past, looking at social media and digital technologies and sort of thinking that nothing really bad can happen because it's all virtual. And then, you know, we all learned that real harm has happened, and physical harm, self-harm, sort of harm to democratic institutions and so on is very real. So I think this idea of, we talked about it beforehand, like burning a flag in a virtual environment, you know, should there even be police? I think hate speech is real, for example, and so there needs to be some kind of intervention in the virtual also by regulators to make sure that these kind of societal norms are kept. And so then the question is, well, who, you were saying, we are designing the system and they sort of almost shape us, right? So then my first question is, well, who designs the system and who is shaped by it? That's not the same group of people. And I think we need to talk about the kind of power dynamics at play. I think that's especially important as we're entering an era of more agentic systems. So not just a language model that, you know, just gives utterances back, but sort of that can really be shaped to be your personal assistant, tailored to your particular needs, based on your history, if you are happy to share your emails with it. And so then the question really is like, well, in whose interest is this operating, and how exactly has this been shaped? What agency, again, I come back to agency, do individuals have to shape it, and where should be the limits of it? So if I want to have something that my personal assistant is supposed to be really hateful because I'm a bigoted person and I wanted to kind of reproduce my racism, you know, should there be limits on that? I think so, but I think we're talking about exactly what the limits are. And then if we have these systems, we're iteratively shaping them. Of course, they shape us. I think the lens through which I find it most useful to discuss this point is the lens of recommender systems. So if we think about any kind of online platform where you get content, you know, people who like this video also like that, who bought this book also like this, that is shaping our preferences. And it's kind of a question around, well, to how is it shaping our preferences and in what interest? And I think the question is not such a crazy new one in the context of AI. I think the question is an old one, and actually we can learn a lot from recommender systems to help us answer how we should do it with AI agents.
Philosophically speaking, I would say you have a very clear utilitarian perspective. No, it seems to me, but maybe not.
I don't think so. No, I mean, as a philosopher, I come from a more virtue ethics perspective. But I'm curious now. Maybe we'll have to talk about it
virtues of
later.
Non-human agents. That's an interesting question. But we'll now open the discussion to all of you. You see, this was also part of TechEthos, not to only recommend measuring bias. Of course, it's important, but to go to these uncharted grounds, raise new and emerging issues and questions. We don't yet have a solution to these questions, but I think it's a plus of the TechEthos project that in many of our deliverables, we were trying to make our readership aware of the existence of such issues. But feel free to talk about chatbots, XR environments, any other issues. So.
And Lexi, I was going to ask you about nation states. I mean, how many of you read The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman, which is a great, great book? But one of the things that he raises is that these virtual worlds diminish the power of the
nation state.
Sure. And if all nation states are doing their own regulating, and XR has no borders, what are the concerns there?
Yes. This reminds me of that wonderful moment in history when the emperor of the Sacred Roman Empire, Barbarossa, came to the Pope on the knees. Are we going to see any leader on the knees before Sam Altman? Or... Yeah,
yes.
well, you see, I think this is the kind of metaphor you're using, right?
We did see Rishi Sunak having a job interview with Elon Musk recently.
Not on the knees, but in a way. So more seriously, definitely, and Laura mentioned this, there's a question of power and the shift of power. And human societies do evolve. We didn't always have nation states. We had different power systems before. Even if in today's society, it's not just the power of the police state. There are religions, there are soft power, kinds of soft power, media power. There are different types of power. So to see what kind of power is emerging here, and whether it will come to what? Replace or modify the political power in our current society is a big question. I don't think anybody has a clear vision, but maybe some ideas, Professor Brooks? No, you've done some thinking on this, I guess.
Let's start. Yes.
Start with the mic, please.
I'll start with the microphone.
Yes.
So, one thing I was thinking of as you were talking about was actually about trust and about in which institutions we can actually trust. Sorry to pick on Google, but when I ask my teenage kids something, they often go, well, I'll just Google it. And essentially in Google we trust. People are getting rid of their encyclopedias, they're getting rid of their reference documents. Everything is online. If it's online, then it's true. Is it? But that's what we are beginning to believe as a society. So the question is, do organizations like Google or other similar ones have too much power?
And also, what does truth become in that world, right? What sort of concept of truth is emerging in this new society with these new generations? Will they still seek to scientifically check facts, or will the very notion of truth? You remember in the New York Times there was several years ago there was a big front page saying truth and the era of fake news. But what is truth, as Pontius Pilatus said? Do you remember that?
Okay, so don't forget
You're
that
getting off
in
into philosophy.
Yes.
don't forget that fake news is not new, though. Disinformation is not new. In the First World War, it was known that there was misrepresentation of some of the actions by the Germans for kind of British purposes in the newspapers. And even though they knew this, they said that they were kind of boiling children to create glue. And they used this headline to galvanize people to join up. So fake news is not new. The medium that we are using it for is new, but fake news is not new.
And the scale, maybe.
And the scale. If I could just bring it back to
Sure.
XR and NLP and things. So you were talking about the deceased. And so my question is, and Laura, you're talking very much about context. So the use of, say, an avatar to recreate sort of a deceased person, okay. But if I give you a slightly different context, maybe someone who has something like dementia or Alzheimer's, and then you use their deceased wife to encourage them to do certain things. They want to stay at home, so they need to be reminded to take their pills to keep them healthy. Where does that now leave the empowerment of the individual? Who is actually controlling that when this concept of informed consent and insight and understanding is not quite as clear as the example of the young man? Is it still legitimate and ethical to do that?
That's a question for me, is it? Yeah, I think for all of us, okay.
Go ahead, Laura.
I'll
Go
take
ahead.
it anyway.
Go ahead, Laura.
I think so. This question of nudging and kind of influencing people is really close to my heart, and I think is something that we really need to make sure we're studying well as we're kind of looking at the actual impact of these technologies. And I think the empowerment of a person with dementia. I'm no expert to say what empowerment of these people look like. I would ask the patient if they're not capable of kind of expressing their best concern. Then, I don't know what is best practice. I would assume a carer, an expert, sort of are the best people to ask, not someone from a tech company. So I think the first step is always to actually have inclusive conversations about it, because I do think there is a question around whose worldviews are being implemented in these technologies. It's clear that if we're just running with what is without actually targeted interventions, we're going to reproduce the same oppressive structures that have existed before the technology. Maybe they're going to be aggravated. We've seen that in bias. So I think there is a real question around, well, what are the kind of possible ways in which this could be beneficial, and actually getting expertise on that topic, I think, is critical. I don't think it is the role of a tech company to answer this question on, should someone with Alzheimer's should be nudged by the voice of their deceased to take their meds. That seems like a really difficult ethics question, and it really requires contextual knowledge and understanding to give a good answer to it, I think.
Mm-hmm. I'll just come back to you on where, tech companies, do you think, to have no responsibility there at all?
No, I'm not saying they have no responsibility. I'm saying the expertise that should inform the decision, which the decision will be taken by the people who also provide the technology, the people who use the technology, right?
Alina, tell me, when people are developing, for example, XR systems for medical use or for therapeutic use or for use with these kinds of patients, I think there are already some processes for focus groups for analyzing the needs of these people. Is it something that is systematically put in place in your industry?
It depends. Obviously, you have XR in healthcare, and obviously that is a specific sort of industry where, I can only say we are not working in the healthcare industry producing content, but especially for XR use within clinics, within surgery where it's already used, I think there it is under certain measures.
And say actually that there's a health technology assessment, so all these kind of devices, they're classed as devices, and there is a substantial amount of regulation for these devices.
And say no, because we are seeing now a gray area between the directive on medical devices and AI regulation. And it's very interesting, and I have some colleagues here who we just had those conversations, who are doing ethical appraisal for the European Commission. A lot of people doing this ethical appraisal are specialists in biomedical ethics, and they know everything about medical devices. And when machine learning comes in, or when XR systems come in, how do they actually evaluate these ML components or XR components of medical devices is a big gray zone. Yes, so yes, there is regulation, but there is a big gray zone between the two areas of biomedical. And this is something we just had this conversation. This is something that I think the appraisal scheme, the ethics appraisal scheme of the European Commission needs to think about and address. And I know that Ivan had a lot of remarks, especially listening to Lawrence, but I'll give the floor to Ivan.
No, I generally just wanted to say that I'm kind of a scholar of techno-pessimism. I like this discipline. I wanted to find out what is the root of all problems of technology that was well listed before by the greats. And the first root, of course, was Johann Gutenberg. When he published books, that was very bad. And it produced a lot of misinformation, including such awful things as the letters of Amerigo Vespucci, who probably faked at least one of his travels to the US, to the Americas, and faked a lot of other things, but he was basically the first travel blogger, and became very popular. And so after his death, the continents were suggested to call America as a flash mob, like in memory of our dear friend Amerigo. How about we call the continents Americas? And the second most popular type of content that was initially published by publishers in Europe, the first was Bible, of course. Bible was a really big hit. The idea to translate it in local languages was a market breaker, because then, kind of, yeah. But the point is that the second type of content that was very popular was basically books, guided books on how to spot a witch. They were very popular, and the harm was very tangible, right? But you can go even further with techno-pessimistic line of thought, and I think the furthest I could go was this dialogue of where Plato talks to Phaedrus, and he basically says that writing things down is a very bad idea, because if you write things down, then the writing cannot answer the questions of the reader, so the reader can misinterpret the writing, and then all goes to ashes, basically. So the only way to do education is to walk in the garden and talk. Just like the Greeks did, right? So my point is that this techno-pessimistic stance is starting with technology itself, I guess. And the question is, if we see by trial and error that some objective criteria improve, let's say length of life or the percentage of people living beyond poverty on the planet, then why cannot we adopt some other stance other than finding the root cause of the problems in the technology? Instead of, maybe we should think why humans are malleable towards these issues, and maybe rethink education in some sense. I think one of the examples mentioned, so we had this dead bots, as Alexei named them, and there was this startup, Replica AI. At some point, when ChatGPT was available as an API, they switched to their API. And then ChatGPT, OpenAI updated their policies and said that sexting would not be allowed with their chatbot. And so Replica had to refrain from using the new model that they switched to and roll back the old one that was not very good in comparison with the OpenAI offering. And the amount of comments they got on the App Store that were basically saying, "You just killed my girlfriend."
They just ruined a lot of people's lives.
It's absolutely staggering.
Ruined a lot of lives with that. I'm going to save the life of this cup. And
can we just ask our Greek in the audience here, wandering in his garden, Mihalis, I just wanted your reflections on this.
It's fascinating. Fortunately or unfortunately, we haven't received any application to review from an ethical perspective on XR. So it's coming, we know, and I'm just thinking whether technology can be used in order to meet ethical purposes. What I mean is, can we use technology to create virtual research participants instead of using humans?
Synthetic data.
Synthetic
very
data.
Important.
Yeah,
very
exactly.
Important area.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think, to move away from also my techno-pessimism and think of using technology, in order to create ethical standards. And
So definitely, and synthetic data. Could you please send the mic there? Synthetic data is a big question in generative AI in biology. We have meetings every 2 weeks, basically, at the French Academy of Medicine, discussing how do we even evaluate ML projects, machine learning projects, trained on synthetic data and applied to real humans. What do we do with that?
Let's come to
No. Let's have a remark. No, we have a remark from somebody who knows this sector very well, and then we'll come to Laura. Please. Please also give your name to the audience.
My name is Birgit van Hursten. I'm an ethics expert for the Commission on Research. My background is in biomedicine, So the digital twins are really the hype at the moment because it avoids doing experiments on real humans. But a digital twin is a static thing. A human is never static. And I think that's also where the limits are. You mentioned Gutenberg. Yeah, he invented the press. He was the one that made all of what we're doing possible because knowledge became available to basically everyone who could enter a library. So, but still, it's static. And we know that a book is static. But I think we fail to realize that XR is static.
No, it's not. It doesn't have to be if you add the time aspect to it. So for instance, if you place virtual content in the physical world, if you add time to it, that time, especially when it converges with the physical surrounding, that content could change over time. So if you come back, it actually changed.
And I also remember to give the floor to Laura, somebody saying, you know, generative AI models are so complex, they virtually reach the level of randomness of nature.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say the digital twins could be dynamic. And I think there's a lot of hopes to turn benchmarks into kind of a dynamic process and to move from this like static data set, frozen in time, to a more dynamic process. So I think that is not my concern with digital twins, but I also have a concern, which is that it's very hard to kind of make sure they're well calibrated. And I think there's sometimes such an optimism about synthetic data. Even in AI, we have it that we say, okay, I have this language model. I want to know whether it outputs something horrible. I don't want to make 10,000 people look through the horrible stuff. I'm going to train an AI to look through it. But at some point, it becomes this kind of spiraling effect where a model evaluates a model and no person even looks at the stuff anymore. And maybe in the very beginning, the AI system was well calibrated to the 20 people or the 200 people whose data it was trained on. But what is the check-in to make sure it stays calibrated? I think we really haven't figured that out, and I think there's too much optimism that doesn't keep these things well in check. The reason I wanted the floor was also because I wanted to kind of come back to your point around tech pessimism. I think there's a real challenge so a lot of us who enter the space of tech ethics have some pessimist tendency. That's why we're here. And I think there was a time where also me as a researcher in sort of the field was really kind of dismantling and deconstructing what's going on, and that was really the most productive and helpful thing we could do. I think we're now at a time where these chatbots of dead people, I wouldn't have come up with it. I probably would have thought it's quite a weird idea, but we now see that for some people there is some benefit. So I think we need to make space for the nuance and actually enter this really constructive kind of area where it's like there is a lot of things potentially wrong with it that need to be taken care of. You know, not everybody should just be able to run freely with their AI and to produce all kinds of harmful content. But I think this more constructive conversation around, well, what is the good here that could be unlocked is really important, because then the imagination of people, for example, in this room can actually enter the process of how we build these technologies. And we don't end up sitting as a gating function at the very end saying, you know, someone else who's excited about the technology, they've put their dreams into the technology, they show it to us, and then there's a question around, well, is this safe enough to go? I think that would be a sad place to sit ultimately. I think we want to enter the nuance and sort of say, well, this is what I think good looks like, this is what bad looks like, and help shape the debate in that way.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, maybe because we're running out of time to before concluding, one remark that I think you probably all agree with, but I think it's also a policy takeaway for us, that there is really no frontier, no clear border between operational questions of design, and the questions that we usually call vision or imagination or philosophy or something. They all come together here without any clear border and clear frontier. So when we decide on synthetic data, on policies on synthetic data, we also need to go quite far and think about, you know, the possible impact on humans, but also stories around this and all the other questions. Now, how we do policy guidelines and recommendations in and after TechEthos in such an area where technology and visions and stories and philosophy and all of these things all come together is a big challenge, and we'll be trying to, of course, address it in the ethics appraisal scheme of the European Commission. But beyond that, I think for each of you, it's a challenge to educate a future generation of people who can think in an informed way about these questions. We didn't talk about education and training, but it's a huge challenge, and of course Ivan is doing this in Würzburg and other people are doing it in your universities. How do we educate a generation of people who will be maybe avid users of generative AI, of XR systems, but also capable of doing the kind of critical and informed thinking that this panel has engaged in? And thank you all again. Back to you, Vivian.
So I was just going to say that I'm going to take an executive decision and just run a couple of minutes more, because one of the things I know you wanted to talk about was red teaming. Because that is a way of trying to get people to imagine scenarios. Just tell us what you mean by red teaming.
So adversarial testing, there are things that, and we'll go back to this to Laura maybe, there are things that you cannot see that a model is capable of if you just do standard benchmarks and standard measurements. You need to put humans in front of a model and let them challenge that model. Let them do some conversations in an adversarial way to see what the model has learned, what it's capable of. There is a famous example where somebody has discovered that a model is capable of lying, although it has never been taught to lie, it doesn't know what lying is, but it's capable of doing so, humanly speaking. So for this, we need time. You remember your question about time? That was the right question in the previous discussion. Because humans are not very fast. They need time to challenge the system. Laura, maybe you can tell us quickly, is this something that has become a part of industrial routine? Because we see in the US, for example, how the Allen Institute is doing this job of red teaming for several producers, including OpenAI. Do we need the analogs of the Allen Institute in Europe that will be given this task of adversarial testing? Do we need an institution for that? Do we already have that? What's going on?
So yeah, the red teaming is a standard practice for any large AI lab. There is a difference between red teaming with sort of general practitioners, could be people like you and me, and red teaming by experts. For example, a medical expert maybe would be better able to, or a nuclear science expert, like, can this model produce something that could in any way be hazardous information? That needs to be expert red teaming. General red teaming could be that I say to a person, I give the instruction, please try everything you can to make the model return hate speech. And let's just see how far you go, because that will help us make the model safer so that we can take care of these kinds of patterns that emerge. So red teaming is standard practice, and it is already done. I think on the time point, there's a question around what is practice here. So the definition of red teaming, there's a paper by a report by the Frontier Model Forum that defines red teaming. I think often red teaming and evaluation get conflated. So that is a resource I could point anyone to for the distinction. And in terms of time, it is common practice in industry to hire large amounts of data workers in short amounts of time. So 10,000 radar hours in the space of a week to do red teaming. There's basically a whole industry which is also under scrutiny for the ethics that it itself operates, but it can be done ethically. That basically a lot of people get hired to do this at scale. And that is one way of dealing with the time question. It's basically to get more people on board with it. But I would say, yeah, it's a standard practice. Do we need other institutions to run it? I think there's a question of who should do the red teaming. How is it done? I actually run a research project on how to do this potentially better. So anybody interested, come talk to me about it.
But also, Laura, there's another thing where actually you hand over the red teaming to the public. Yes, you do your red teaming by the experts, but you also do red teaming and you throw it out to people who use their creativity and imagination to imagine things that might, because actually we are rather good at being creative and imaginative as humans. And I think there's a difference, isn't there, between pessimism averse, which is quite a lot of tech companies are pessimism averse, where you're the other direction. But we see repeatedly the things that we fear. So image recognition, all the things we fear. What is it used most for? Is cats on the internet. I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing that has come out of that. So there's so much here. There's so much that needs to be done, and the speed at which we need to travel on this path is intense. It really is intense. And the trouble is that the ethics, as we've repeatedly said, is deliberative and slower. So maybe those are things that we need to go away from. I think what we've proved here is that what a fantastic discussion it was, and I suspect that all of you are going to have a mass to talk about over lunch, because you've sparked so many different conversations. Delina.
One last thing, and I think actually this panel represents that we also need a cross-industry collaboration, because we also need to build these bridges between technologies and between industries. So we are not looking at solutions in our little bubble. And I think the conversation and the bridges between XR, which is the visualization aspect of AI, and other technologies is so important, because we got cross-parallel challenges and we need to work cross-industry on this.
You see, we just can't stop
because
you're human.
It's terrific. And I have to say that Laura and I did do a little test in the Times this morning, which was to test which images were real of people and which were AI generated. We got 3 out of 10. So we're not very good at it. AI systems are better at it. And can I just say that I was hearing a South Korean speak on AI last week, and she said that in South Korea it is now possible for you to marry, to have a proper certificate.
In Japan a couple of years ago.
Yes.
But it's still not possible, even in South Korea, to have the pleasure from a beautiful lunch, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Of tasting that. That's still very human.
That's still very human. So it's now lunch, and we'll be back at 2:15. And please thank our panel.
Thank you.